Well, we're so excited that you're here this morning. Welcome to week 3 of our series, Here I Am. Just as a reminder, we're doing a series of character studies about the stories of those individuals in Scripture who, they gave God their yes, they counted the cost, they said, here I am, God, send me. And we're wrestling with what it looks like to actually give God our yes as well. Now, we tend to sort of put these individuals on a pedestal and to make assumptions about how amazing they were. And when you see someone on the tail end, on the backside of obedience, it's easy to look at that situation and everything that's going on in their life and to make the assumption, man, they're just different. Like there's just something about them. They're special. I could never say yes to God the way that person said yes to God. In fact, this is often our excuse for not saying yes to God is I'm not like those people in the Bible. They were special. They were different. And I'm just a regular person. Today's story is going to completely undo that misconception as we look at someone who made himself available to God only to backpedal once he felt the weight of God's actual call. So turn with me to Exodus chapter 36. If you're using one of our Bibles, we'll be on Exodus 3 rather, will be on page 36 in our Bibles. And if you want to follow along, you can raise your hand. The ushers will bring you one. If you don't own one, please raise your hand. We'd love to give you one as a gift. Exodus chapter 3, it's likely many of you are familiar with today's individual. For those who don't or you don't know the Bible as well, don't worry. I'll give you some backstory to kind of clear things up. To give a little history of this guy, his name is Moses. And to give a little bit of history from Moses so no one is confused, Moses was an Israelite. He was born an Israelite who was, through a series of circumstances, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the palace until adulthood. So he was raised as an Egyptian, but he was an Israelite, and he never had an interaction with his people directly, but he felt a burden for his people who were in slavery in Egypt, literally serving him and his Egyptian family and his Egyptian nation. One day he saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite slave, and he came to the defense of that slave, and in the altercation, he actually ended up killing the Egyptian, and at that point he has to run for his life to get away from this murder charge, and he ends up on the backside of the desert, where he meets this woman, he marries her, goes to work for her father, and when we pick up the story, he's been a shepherd in the desert for 40 years. So he's royalty, fallen from grace, guilty of murder, hiding in the desert. This is the least likely candidate to be used by a holy God, and this is the first thought I want you to latch onto today, okay? Here it is. Never assume you are too far, too lost for God to find you. Never assume, no matter what's happened in your life, that you're too lost for God to find you. Right now you might be thinking about yourself, man, I'm so lost in life. I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe you still love God, you're still seeking Him, but you just can't see Him right now. You feel lost in life. Or at least you can't see what's next, what's coming. You just need some direction. That was Moses. He's a broken, humbled shepherd in his 80s. Okay? And that's where we're going to pick this up. Exodus chapter 3, starting with verse 1. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. Now, sometimes it's translated Sinai. Sometimes it's translated Horeb. Some scholars think it's the same mountain. Others say it's different. Horeb means desert or desolation. Okay, and so that kind of gives you a mental picture of where he's trying to feed these sheep. Here's a picture, it's a pretty inhospitable place, especially if you're raising sheep. Now, I know right now to you, that does not look terrible, but that's because you're used to looking at this. And so it's all perspective, but to him, it was this inhospitable place. It was definitely not paradise. And what a terrible place to be a shepherd to try to find green grass and food to feed your sheep. So Moses was shepherding ordinary sheep and herding around ordinary sheep on an ordinary day in a completely forgotten and forsaken type place. He didn't even have sheep to call his own. They weren't his. They were his father-in-law's sheep. He was just working for him. There was nothing that made him feel anything other than ordinary in this moment. But this is something we could all afford to learn about God. Often God calls us to participate in the extraordinary, but He does so right in the middle of our ordinary. Look at verse 2. It says, there, right in the midst of all that, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire in the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. Now, angel of the Lord here is actually referring to God himself. It was a manifestation of the presence of God. And I want to read this verse in another translation because I want you to see a particular picture in the words. Verse 2 in the ESV version of the Bible says this, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the middle of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed." Now, I want to key in on that idea of he looked, or literally he turned aside. So here's the picture. Moses is doing what he ordinarily does, and off to the side, he sees the light of a fire kind of out of the corner of his eye, and his attention is diverted to a bush that is burning out in the wilderness. But what's unusual is it was not consumed by the fire, and his curiosity is piqued. Now, it wasn't unusual for bushes to be burning in the wilderness with the heat in the desert, and a small spark will start a fire, but this bush was burning, but it was not being consumed. It wasn't burning up. Verse 3. "This is amazing," Moses said to himself. "Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it." I want you to note that in Scripture, the presence of God is often symbolized by fire. In Genesis, God posted an angel at the garden entrance with a flaming sword to guard the way. Later in Exodus, Moses and God's people will follow God in the form of a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire at night. When God descends on the mountain to give the Israelites the Ten Commandments, it says it was as if fire or smoke and fire covered the whole mountain. Okay? Even his work, even his presence in our lives is often referred to as a refining fire. Well, in this moment, Moses' ordinary is interrupted by the extraordinary. And his curiosity is piqued, and he turns aside, and he turns his attention to this bush. Verse 4. "When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' 'Here I am,' Moses replied." Now, we've only been in this series a couple of weeks, but you've probably realized that's real early for a "here I am," isn't it? I want you to note how this goes down. God calls Moses by name, which sets the framework. This is going to be personal. And Moses simply responds to the burning bush, "Here I am." Now, I may be wrong in my assumption here, and please forgive me for my boldness in jumping to conclusions, but it seems to me that Moses might have said, "Here I am," before he knew what that would actually mean for his life. And I wonder if you've ever done that with God. I wonder if there are people in church today, you find yourself in a similar situation as Moses in your life right now, right? At some point in your ordinary life, something happened that caused you to take notice of God or church or the things of God, maybe even put your faith in him, but what got you to where you were in your faith wasn't this radical obedience. You were actually driven by curiosity about the miraculous, and before you knew it, you were saying, "Here I am," without fully realizing what you were getting yourself into. God used Moses' initial curiosity to cause him to draw near, but the burning bush was never the point of the story. The burning bush wasn't actually the biggest miracle. The real miracle was that God met Moses in that moment. The true miracle happened when Moses was interrupted by God and he turned aside and approached the miraculous. We read in verse 5, God said, do not come any closer, the Lord warned. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. Please hear this. Wherever God's presence is, that place is holy. Wherever God draws near, wherever his presence is, that place is holy. And you might say, wait a minute, I thought God was everywhere. To which I would say, exactly. Exactly. The presence of God permeates every part of this world, but it's missed in the place that's not ready to turn aside and see him. So this isn't so much a statement about a particular place, right? God wasn't saying this exact location in the desert is now holy. What he was doing was helping Moses acknowledge the reality of his presence. He was saying, listen, when you draw aside and you turn near me, you draw near to me, that moment becomes a holy moment and that place becomes a holy place. Because it's God that makes the moment holy. Literally, the translation here could be, stop coming towards me the way you are. Don't draw near to me unless you're ready for what I have for you. Taking off your sandals was a symbol of reverence. As slaves were usually barefoot, they didn't have shoes. And this was like an acknowledgement of servitude and honor. It was a humility thing. God said, Moses, don't come to me the way you are. First, take off your shoes and acknowledge your position before me. Don't come any closer until you're actually ready, Moses. There's a poet named Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote a poem once, and in that she had this line: "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God." Now, it's an obvious reference to this story. It's a beautiful picture of God's imprint on the world. It's a picture of God's fingerprints all over creation. But let me have you consider a thought for just a moment. What if burning bushes are actually pretty common? What if burning bushes are actually a dime a dozen? What if there are moments all over the place where God is trying to reach out? He's trying to get our attention. He's all around us, working all the time. What if the miracle of the burning bush isn't actually the bush itself? It's that Moses turned aside and drew near to the miraculous. What if all around us every day are these miraculous moments where God is reaching out? He's just waiting for us to open our eyes and see it, hoping to interrupt our lives and grab our attention. What if we're missing him? Let me go back to our story, see how Moses responded. Verse 6. "I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Maybe that's your reaction to God right now. You ever been going about, your life, doing your thing, and not really expecting to be interrupted by God, and then all of a sudden he's like right there in your face? A situation occurs, you're confronted with an opportunity, and it's like God saying, "Hey, this is me, it's me." And rather than leaning into the voice of God, you're tempted to cover your face and ignore what he's saying because you're afraid to look at God. You're afraid to give him permission to mess up your life. I mean, man, this is my story. I was going to be rich. That was the plan. I was going to drive a Porsche 911. I wasn't going to have any kids at all. Now I'm a 44-year-old pastor, a dad of 3, married 21 years. I am not rich. And I am happier than I could have ever imagined. I am more blessed, more fulfilled than I could ever imagine. But when God first called me, when he first spoke to me, when he said, "I want you to go into ministry," when he called me to turn aside, I was a hard pass. Like, no, I don't want that at all. Moses tries to hide his face from God, but God, in his grace, just keeps on talking. Verse 7. "Then the Lord told him, I've certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I'm aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptian and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, the land where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites now live. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abuse them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt." See, God, this is why I don't talk to you. Right? That's got to be what Moses is thinking. This is why so many of us are tempted to hide from God. This is why we tend to not listen too closely to his voice, because we try to keep him at a distance because we're afraid. God has just suggested that Moses, of all people, go back to Egypt, to the place he'd run from in the first place, to the place he's hiding from a murder charge. And God thinks he's the right person to go back? No way. But think about it for just a moment. Moses killed an Egyptian while he was protecting who? An Israelite. He always had a heart that broke for his people, even though he wasn't raised in their culture. He had a heart inside him that broke to the point of longing to see justice done for Israel, even to the point of defending the Israelite, killing the Egyptian. Now, granted, his heart was already fully committed to this call. It was like it was in him. Granted, he handled it really poorly, okay? When he went on his own, he did it really poorly. But this is actually, it's as if the call of God was implanted in him from birth, and he is actually the perfect, maybe the only person to carry out that specific call. Despite his flaws, despite his brokenness, despite the mistakes, despite all of it. And what if you are actually the perfect person to carry out your call despite your flaws, despite your mistakes, and guess what? You haven't missed it. You're not too broken. It's not too late. God still wants to use you. You're never beyond a point where God can redeem and renew you if you would just turn aside, if you would just listen to his voice And not only never assume you're too lost for God to find you, but never assume you're too lost for God to use you. And how he longs to use you. So how did our hero respond? Again, we're quick to attribute these stories to like these, the people in these stories, this mythical quality, like they're greater, they're bigger than life. But the Bible is just real stories of real people, ordinary people that God called to do extraordinary things. People who, just like you and me, had to choose to say yes to God. So how does Moses respond? How's our hero respond? Verse 11. But Moses protested to God. Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? Moses, this hero of the faith, makes excuses. The image of Moses we have in our heads is the one from Hebrews chapter 11. The mighty hero of faith who stood up to Pharaoh, who led the Israelites, out of slavery, across the Red Sea, parted the waters with the staff, who received the 10 commandments from God, who spoke to God face to face. All of that's true, but all of that is who Moses would become. It's not who he was. And this is actually the first of 4 different excuses we find here. We're going to look at these excuses real quickly, one by one, and you may relate to some of them, all of them. Moses had said to God, "Here I am," but now that he knows what that actually means, what God actually wants him to do, it shifted from "here I am" to "I don't think I'm here anymore." Maybe not so much. See, it's one thing to give God your yes on Sunday in a service. It's another thing completely to live out your yes in the real world, isn't it? So let's look at these excuses together. Excuse number 1 he makes is just that simply that, who am I? Who am I? This is a statement of inadequacy. God, do you know who I am? Do you know the mistakes I made? Moses is incredibly reluctant to do what God has called him to do. 40 years ago, maybe. 40 years ago, he was somebody. 40 years ago, he was a prince in Egypt. Now, after 40 years of chasing his father-in-law's sheep in the desert, he's just this lost, confused fugitive. He's 2 basic objections to the whole plan. First, I don't want to mess with Pharaoh. Second, I don't think people would follow me. Who would follow me? He thought the whole idea was a disaster from the get-go. And maybe God should look somewhere else for a leader. And I think every one of us has our own version of this excuse, don't we? Oh, God, you don't want me. God, you can't use somebody else. You can't use me. God, do you know what I've done? There's no way that you could use me, God. God answers, verse 12, I will be with you. And this is your sign that I'm the one who sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain. God says, I'm going to be with you, and he answers Moses' excuse in 2 ways. First, he just makes the promise, I'm going to be there. I got you. I'm going to be with you. But second, he gives Moses a sign, like a proof of his presence. Because as it turns out, God's identity is way more important than my identity. Like when we can know who God is and that he won't leave us, we can step confidently into any call because God is with us. Well, far from convinced, our hero comes up with a second excuse. Verse 13. But Moses protested, if I go to the people of Israel and I tell them that the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? So excuse number 2 is, who are you? Or more literally, who should I tell them you are? This is a statement of insecurity. It's the same insecurity we feel in living out our faith. How many of the people you interact with every single day would say they know you are a sold-out Jesus follower? They know you're a Christian. How many people would describe you primarily as a person of faith and not just a person who goes to church sometime? Moses is, God, I have faith in you, but who should I tell them you even are? Verse 14. God replied to Moses, I am who I say I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So God says, I am who I am. He feels no need to explain himself, to justify himself, to apologize for himself, to make excuses, to justify his existence. He says, Moses says, who should I tell them you are? And the answer is, I'm God. I'm the God. I'm the only God. There's only one God, and I'm him. So tell them, I am. The one I am has sent you. Tell them God sent you. Not a God. The God has sent you. It's not your job, Moses, to convince them, but it is your job to carry my name wherever you go. I'm God, and that's enough. But for Moses, it's not enough. Which leads to the next excuse. Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. But Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord never appeared to you? So excuse number 3 is, what if people don't believe me? Okay, God, fine, I accept who you are. I believe who you are. That's all great. But what if the people you're sending me to don't believe? What if they think I'm crazy or a religious nut or something? And what's funny about this is God already told Moses they would listen to him. In Exodus 3, verse 18, he wrote this: the elders of Israel will accept your message. So God says, hey, they're going to accept your message. And Moses says, yeah, but what if they don't? God, I know, God, you're perfect. I know that you know everything. I know that you're extremely patient. What if they don't? I mean, at some point, God's got to be like, seriously, Moses, seriously. He's saying to God, I know, God, that you promised this, but what if you're wrong, God? I know you think you know, but what if you're wrong? See, at some point, our no stops being about questioning us, and it actually becomes about questioning God and whether or not we believe we can take him at his word. Moses' problem wasn't understanding. He knew his call. His problem, like so many of us, was fear. He wanted perfect assurances everything was going to work out right. And we do the same thing to God all the time. We want God's call to not only always be clear, but also be easy. And so we get caught up in our needs and our what ifs and our questions. But here's something you need to understand about God. As long as you're saying what if, you aren't obeying, you're negotiating. And I got to tell you, they're not the same thing. And you can almost hear God sigh. Verse 2. Then the Lord asked him, what is that in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. Throw it down on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw down the staff and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand. Perform this sign, the Lord told him. Then they will believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, really has appeared to you. Now, you ever wonder why it was a snake? A lot of people will say it has to do with Adam and Eve and the original serpent, but remember, they're about to go up against Pharaoh and Egypt. Now, throughout much of Egypt's history, Pharaoh wore a cobra made of metal or wood on the front of his headdress as a symbol of his power and sovereignty. So God has Moses' common staff turn into a snake, a symbol of his authority, a symbol of the power of Moses' words and of the one true king, the God, the I am, who's behind the miracle. Moses throws his staff down and becomes a snake, and then God says, pick the snake up by the tail, which in real life is stupid, but when God is involved, okay, God, and Moses grabs the staff, it becomes a snake again. Or grabs the snake, it becomes a staff again. And this is a beautiful reflection of the point of the whole story. God uses ordinary people, and he uses whatever they have available, okay? He makes the ordinary miraculous through our obedience. God would use that very same staff to part the Red Sea, to strike a rock and bring water pouring out of the rock, to be held up over battle that Israel was fighting, and as long as he kept his hands up, they were miraculously winning. This is the same staff, but listen, God doesn't stop here. He gives Moses 3 signs. He says if they don't believe the first sign about the snake, throw the snake down. Then the second sign, stick your hand inside your coat and pull it out. And when you do, it will be all diseased. And then put it back in. And when you pull it out again, it will be healed. If they don't believe that, take some water out of the Nile River, pour it on the ground. It will turn into blood right before their eyes. 3 miraculous signs. And still that's not enough for Moses. Excuse number 4 is, what if I mess it up? Maybe you find yourself wrestling with that. God, what if I mess this up? Verse 10, but Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh God, I'm not very good with words. I've never been good with words. I'm not now. Even though you've spoken to me, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. Now, how often do we use our shortcomings as an excuse to not do what God's calling us to do? Moses says, I can't do this. I'm not skilled. I'm not the right guy. And the literal translation is, I'm heavy of mouth. Okay? And I want you to note this. God never corrects him. God never says, oh no, Moses, you're a great speaker. He doesn't correct him at all. What God does is he takes away yet another excuse in verse 11. Then the Lord asked Moses, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak, hear or do not hear, see or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. Listen, I don't know what you think your limitations are. What you can do is completely beside the point. Whatever God is calling you to turn to him and to give him your yes, he will give you everything you need to succeed in that call. There's an old saying, God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the called. I think that's true. It's pretty much takes every excuse we have out of the book. I mean, listen, in high school, my greatest fear was public speaking. Public speaking, y'all. Come on. And God's going to make me a pastor. Listen, we cannot be arrogant enough to think that we have the power to derail the plans of Almighty God with our inadequacy. If God calls you, he'll equip you. And how he longs to call you, to use you, if you'll just get out of your own way and listen. Verse 13. But Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send anyone else. So Moses finally said, here I am, send that guy. Here I am, send somebody else. This has been the cry of his heart, And maybe this is the cry of your heart as God is calling out to you. God, here I am, but please don't use me. Use somebody else. Verse 14 says, then the Lord became angry at Moses. All right, he said, what about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he speaks well. And look, he's on his way to meet you now. He'll be delighted to see you. Talk to him and put words in his mouth. I will be with both of you as you speak, and I will instruct you both in what to do. Aaron will be your spokesperson to the people. He will be your mouthpiece, and you will stand in the place of God for him, telling him what to say. And take your shepherd staff with you and use it to perform the miraculous signs I have shown you. Listen, here's the point. God does not use spiritual heroes to do his work. He forms people into spiritual heroes through his work. Never assume you're too lost for God to find you. Never assume you're too lost for God to use you. And never assume God is going to give up on you. He'll never give up on you. God calls ordinary people in ordinary lives, people with baggage and with problems and with history and with issues, people full of excuses why God can't use them. And when we surrender, he does the miraculous. He does the extraordinary through the ordinary. Right around you right now in these seats, there are people sitting around you right now who are just like you, who have led missions trips, who are leading small groups, who have discipled people one-on-one, people who are hosting kids through Harbor Families, who serve every week in kids ministry, who visit in the hospital. People just like you who are giving God their yes, and you can too. Don't let your life be the excuse not to be used by God. Pay attention. Watch for him. And when you see him at work, turn aside. Listen. Set aside your excuses and say to God, here I am. I promise you it's worth it.